The shrimp fork was still cold in my hand when I felt it, that eerie, unmistakable stillness that always precedes a sudden, violent shift in your world. The grand ballroom of the hotel was a monument to corporate vanity, all marble echoes, high gilded ceilings, and massive glass chandeliers that cast a harsh, glittering light over the attendees. It was the kind of room where egos were as polished as the custom silver cufflinks, and the expensive Chardonnay flowed like a river of sweet, expensive denial. I sat at table 11, positioned right next to Donald Galloway, the chief executive officer of Apex Systems. Galloway was a quiet, imposing man whose brief handshake once decided a $120 million logistics and manufacturing deal. My suit was plain, dark charcoal, practical, with a conservative tie knotted just tight enough to signal that I was not there to impress the executives. I was there to ensure that their sprawling supply chains did not grind to a halt, and yet, somehow, I already knew this would be my last industry gala. I was not anyone special by title, just a senior operations liaison, a name buried on page 58 of a 450-page master service agreement, listed under a section labeled Essential Continuity. The corporate lawyers called it a key personnel clause. I called it my invisible ink, only visible when someone was foolish enough to shine a flashlight on it. And tonight, I was holding the flashlight. Before I go any further, I should explain the layout of my world. I had been with Hampton and Cross for 15 years, long enough to remember when we kept physical files in metal cabinets and people actually made eye contact in the hallways. My job was not glamorous, but it was the steel rebar inside the concrete of the company. Every Tuesday morning, I had standing conference calls with the procurement leads at Apex Systems. Every Friday afternoon, I reviewed our shipment redundancies like a doctor checking vital signs in an intensive care unit. Every month, I recalibrated our performance metrics, saving the firm millions of dollars and padding my managers' quarterly bonuses for over a decade. In the corporate world, memory is a very short-lived commodity, especially when a new executive arrives with a point to prove to the board. I had spent my youth in the Navy, working on the flight deck of a massive aircraft carrier. In that environment, you learn that small mistakes could cost lives, and you learn to respect the machinery and the people who kept it running. I carried that mindset into my civilian career, treating our supply chains and logistics networks as critical life support systems. I built redundancies into every route, established backup plans for every supplier, and made sure that we had a solution ready before a problem even arose. It was a methodical, quiet way of working that did not attract much attention, but it kept the business running smoothly for 15 years. His name was Preston Cole. Preston was the new vice president of operations, a 32-year-old who wore designer loafers without socks and referred to experienced workers over 40 as legacy liabilities. He had arrived 5 months ago, fresh from a consulting firm, with a slide deck full of buzzwords and a mandate to increase margins by any means necessary. Preston took one look at my salary line on the spreadsheet and decided it was a number he could delete to show the board how much fat he could trim. Preston did not ask who wrote our service level agreements. He did not ask who brokered the original contract with Apex Systems after our competitor misrouted a massive shipment of turbine housings. He just saw an older guy who used clear bullet points instead of modern management jargon, and he figured I was past my expiration date. Over the last 5 months, I watched a slow, calculated bleed of our department. Brenda from finance was let go after 20 years of service, replaced by a cheap consulting firm that could not balance a ledger. Roger from database systems was restructured out of his job, his duties pushed onto an overworked junior engineer who did not know the difference between a query and a table lock. Then my own digital permissions began to vanish, one database at a time. Human resources stopped responding to my inquiries. Even the small things changed. My invites to the weekly operations reviews simply stopped appearing on my calendar. It was a quiet, deliberate campaign of exclusion, the kind of corporate gaslighting that makes you doubt your own eyes until your building badge stops working and no one bothers to tell you why. So I did what any careful operations man would do. I went into our secure archives and printed the original master service agreement. I highlighted clause 19.3 in bright yellow, folded the paper neatly, and placed it in my leather folio. It was the only shield I needed, and I was just waiting for Preston to run into it. The clause had been written in August of 2015, after a major shipping delay nearly cost us the Apex account. Galloway had insisted on the clause, stating that certain personnel were too critical to be replaced without mutual consent. My name was the first one listed, followed by Brenda's and Roger's. Preston had already fired Brenda and Roger, violating the spirit of the agreement, but firing me would violate the letter of the law. The gala was the perfect stage for the final act. Galloway leaned toward me, asking about our new tracking systems and how they would affect their Midwest distribution. I answered him clearly, explaining the mechanical adjustments and backup routing, keeping my voice calm and steady. Across the room, Preston was laughing loudly with a group of partners, gesturing with a glass of champagne, completely ignoring my existence. He had spent the last month telling the senior partners that he was modernizing the department, and to him, I was already a ghost. But ghosts have a way of making people pay attention when they start pulling the foundation out from under the house. I watched him take another sip of his drink, his face flushed with the easy confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He had no idea that the contract he had signed without reading was about to become his own professional obituary. I turned back to Galloway, continuing our conversation about logistics, matching his calm tone with my own. The music of the string quartet swelled in the background, a pleasant, elegant soundtrack to a quiet, corporate execution. The dinner service was moving slowly, the waiters carrying plates of cold veal that looked far more expensive than they tasted. Galloway was quiet for a moment, swirling the dark bourbon in his heavy lowball glass. He was a veteran of the logistics industry, a man who had survived 3 separate market crashes by focusing on real tangible metrics rather than the flashy slides of consulting presentations. He looked at me, his gray eyebrows raised slightly. He noted that the shipping numbers from our eastern sector had been remarkably stable despite the recent weather delays. I thanked him, letting him know that we had rerouted the shipments through our secondary hub before the storm even hit the coast. He nodded slowly, appreciating the foresight. He knew as well as I did that in our business, a delay of even 12 hours could cost a customer hundreds of thousands of dollars in penalties and lost retail space. Meanwhile, across the grand ballroom, Preston was holding court with a circle of junior analysts who were hanging on his every word. He was talking about artificial intelligence integration and lean staffing models, using terms he had likely copied from a business blog that morning. He never looked toward table 11. He did not acknowledge that the man who had spent 15 years keeping those systems running was sitting right next to the client who paid our bills. To Preston, I was just an expense to be managed, a relic of a time when people stayed at one company and expected their loyalty to be rewarded. He believed that he was the future of the company, and that people like me were just obstacles in his path to a promotion. I looked down at my plate, picking at the cold greens. I thought about Brenda, who had been escorted from the building by security after 2 decades of flawless bookkeeping, and Roger, whose retirement plan was cut short by a generic email. The corporate machine did not have a heart. It only had a hunger for short-term cost savings. But I knew that the legal framework of our agreement with Apex Systems was not built on vibes. It was built on the hard work of people who understood that consistency was the only thing that kept a shipping line from collapsing. I remembered the long nights we had spent in the office during the 2018 supply chain crisis, working to ensure that Apex received their components on time. Gerald, our old manager, had been there with us, ordering pizza and double-checking the manifests. Preston would never do that. He would be at home, posting about operational efficiency on his social media profile. Galloway asked me about our upcoming compliance audit. I explained that we were fully prepared, but I mentioned that some of the administrative access codes had been updated recently as part of a security review. He frowned, just a small tightening of the skin around his eyes. He asked if the validation process was still on track. I assured him that the data was solid, but I did not mention that I had been locked out of the database for the last 72 hours. I wanted to see if Preston's new systems engineer, a young man who spent more time on social media than in the server room, would notice the automated alerts. The database was programmed to send a warning if the validation was not completed within the 30-day window, and that deadline was fast approaching. The junior engineer, Liam, had been hired to replace Roger, but he had no experience with our custom mainframe. He was a nice kid, but he was completely out of his depth. He spent his days updating his status and trying to look busy, while the actual maintenance of the database was ignored. I had offered to show him the validation protocols, but Preston had blocked the meeting, stating that we needed to focus on our core responsibilities. I did not argue. I simply did what I was told and focused on my basic maintenance paperwork, leaving the database to its own devices. The main course was cleared, and the servers began placing plates of burnt creme brulee on the tables. It was exactly at 8:42 in the evening when my phone vibrated in my jacket pocket. It was a long, steady buzz, the kind that usually signaled an emergency alert. I reached into my coat, pulled out the screen, and unlocked it. The message was from Preston. It read, "Hand in your badge Monday morning. We are streamlining operations. Your services are no longer required." There was no greeting. There was no explanation. It was just a cold sentence sent via text message in the middle of an industry event where I was representing the company. I sat there in the warm light of the ballroom, feeling a deep, solid stillness take hold of me. I did not feel angry or afraid. I just felt the weight of 15 years of work crystallizing into a single sharp point. I turned my phone slightly, letting Galloway see the screen. He read the text once, then read it again, his face turning hard and cold. He set his fork down, his eyes locked on mine. He knew exactly what this meant, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. The silence between us was louder than the music and the laughter of the ballroom. Galloway leaned back, his hand resting on the table, his expression completely blank, but his eyes sharp and focused. He looked across the room at Preston, who was still laughing with his group, completely unaware that he had just set off a legal landmine. Galloway turned back to me, his voice calm and quiet. He asked me if I had my copy of the contract. I nodded, tapping my leather folio. He gave a small, grim smile and said that it was time to see how well Preston could swim in deep water. Galloway set his bourbon glass down on the white tablecloth with a soft, heavy thud. He did not blink, and he did not show any outward sign of surprise. He was the head of a firm that managed $90 million in defense contracts, and he knew a liability when he saw one. He looked at me, his voice dropping to a whisper that was easily lost in the chatter of the ballroom. He asked me if I was certain about Clause 19.3. I nodded once, my expression completely neutral. Galloway reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, a secure device that he used for high-level business communications. He began to type with his thumbs, his movements deliberate and slow. He did not look up from the screen as he wrote. When he was finished, he held the phone out so I could read the draft. The message was addressed to Preston. It read, "I believe you have just breached and terminated our master service agreement as well. Expect our legal counsel in court." Galloway looked at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation. I did not blink. I simply nodded. He pressed the send button and the screen went dark. He slid the phone back into his coat pocket and picked up his dessert spoon, tapping the caramelized sugar on his plate as if we had just finished discussing the price of steel. Across the room, I watched Preston. He was in the middle of telling a story, his hands gesturing wildly when his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, his smile still broad, but as he read the message, the color drained from his face so fast it looked like he had seen a specter. His jaw tightened, and he stood up so fast he nearly knocked his chair over. He did not say a word to the people around him. He just turned and walked quickly toward the exit, his expensive loafers clicking on the marble floor as he disappeared into the shadows of the lobby. I could see the panic in his posture, the sudden realization that he had made a catastrophic error. The group of junior analysts he had been entertaining stood there in silence, looking confused by his abrupt departure. He had spent months bragging about how he was going to optimize the company, and with a single text message, he had destroyed our relationship with our largest client. I finished my dessert in silence. The rest of the evening went by like a scene from a movie with the sound turned down. There were speeches, awards, and polite applause, but I was already miles away. I knew that the gears of the legal machine had already begun to turn, and once they started, there was nothing Preston could do to stop them. I said my goodbyes to the other guests at table 11, thanked Galloway for the dinner, and walked out to my car. The night air was cool and refreshing, and I felt a sense of freedom that I had not experienced in years. I drove home, listening to the quiet hum of the engine, and I went to bed knowing that my time at Hampton and Cross was finally at an end. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 8:15. The building was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I walked to my desk, pulled a cardboard box from beneath the table, and began packing my personal items. I did not have much to take: a few reference manuals, a coffee mug, and a framed photograph of my family. As I was wrapping my charger cord, Miles, the young facility coordinator, walked up to my cubicle. He looked uncomfortable, holding a clipboard and refusing to make eye contact. He mumbled that he had been instructed to escort me out of the building. He was a good kid, and I could tell he hated being the one to do this. I told him there was no need to worry, that I was ready to go. I had seen enough people escorted from the building to know the routine, and I had no intention of making it difficult for him. I packed my box, slid my security badge across the desk, and walked out the front door into the bright morning sun. I did not feel any anger or regret. I had done my job faithfully for 15 years, and I was leaving with my integrity intact. I got into my car, adjusted my rearview mirror, and waited. At 9:02, my phone buzzed. The message was from Galloway. It read, "Sit tight. This gets fun." I smiled, started the engine, and drove home to tend to my garden. I spent the rest of the day in the backyard, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. The corporate office felt like a distant memory, a place where people traded their time and their dignity for a paycheck. I was glad to be out of it, and I was looking forward to watching the fallout from Preston's foolish decision. I knew that Galloway's legal team would not waste any time, and that the executives at Hampton and Cross were in for a very difficult week. They had allowed a junior manager to drive away the people who kept the company running, and now they were going to have to pay the price for their neglect. I sat on my porch, drinking a cup of hot tea, and I felt a deep, profound sense of peace. The storm was coming, but I was safe on the shore, watching the waves crash against the rocks. By Tuesday morning, the storm had reached the upper levels of Hampton and Cross. The legal department at Apex Systems did not send a warning letter or request a conference call. They simply filed a formal breach of contract lawsuit in federal court, demanding $46 million in immediate damages. The lawsuit cited a material breach of the Master Service Agreement, specifically pointing to Clause 19.3, which required the company to maintain designated essential personnel to ensure the continuity of their defense logistics. My name, Howard Miller, was listed at the top of the contract appendix as the sole designated officer for the Apex accounts. By unilaterally firing me without 30 days written notice and mutual consent, Preston had effectively terminated the agreement. The impact was immediate and devastating. Without my active credentials, our automated logistics systems could not validate the shipping logs for 7 different military supply chains. The systems began flagging shipments as non-compliant, halting deliveries across 3 states. The warehouse floors were quickly piled high with shipping crates that could not be moved, and the logistics managers were in a state of complete panic. They did not have the administrative access to override the system, and the database warning alerts were flashing red across every terminal in the office. The drivers were sitting in their trucks, drinking coffee and complaining about the delays, while the shipping bay remained gridlocked. The shipping hubs in California, Texas, and Illinois reported massive queues of transport vehicles, creating an administrative bottleneck that threatened to shut down defense logistics for the entire division. The executive board at Hampton and Cross was called into an emergency session that lasted until midnight. A leaked email thread from the chief operating officer went viral within the company, containing just one question in the subject line: "Who approved firing Howard Miller?" The thread remained completely blank, with none of the vice presidents willing to put their names on the record. Preston had acted entirely on his own, without consulting legal counsel or human resources, believing that he could simply present my termination as a cost-saving measure on his quarterly report. He had ignored the warnings from his own team, and now he was facing the consequences of his arrogance. The board members were furious, and they were already looking for a way to distance themselves from Preston's decision. They realized that his attempt to save a few $1,000s had put a $46 million contract at risk. The company's stock dropped 8 points by the close of business on Tuesday, wiping out millions in market value. The general counsel of Hampton and Cross was reported to have thrown a binder across the conference room, shouting at Preston for his sheer incompetence. They tried to reach out to Galloway to negotiate a settlement, but Galloway refused to take their calls. He simply referred them to his legal team, who were already preparing to petition the court for a summary judgment. The board members were in a state of complete panic, and they were already planning to place Preston on leave to protect the reputation of the firm. The legal consequences were clear. A failure of this magnitude would disqualify the company from future federal logistics bids, representing an existential threat to the business. At home, I spent my days sitting on my back porch, drinking coffee and watching the local wildlife. For 15 years, I had worked 50 hours a week, worrying about shipments, customs clearance, and inventory levels. Now the silence was clean and peaceful. I did not feel any need to celebrate their panic. The contract was clear, and Preston's own arrogance had pulled the trigger. I had warned him months ago that our systems were too interconnected to be managed by spreadsheets alone, but he had refused to listen. Now, the company was paying the price for his education. On Thursday afternoon, a courier arrived at my house, handing me a thick envelope from the legal department of Hampton and Cross. They were offering me a severance package of $150,000, provided that I signed a non-disclosure agreement and agreed to return to the office as an independent consultant for 90 days to train Preston's new staff. The contract was full of legal jargon designed to protect the company and limit my options. I read the document, smiled, and threw it into the recycling bin. They still did not understand that you cannot buy back the foundation once you have already demolished the house. I went back to my coffee, enjoying the warm afternoon breeze. The corporate giants were scrambling, trying to fix a leak that they had created themselves, and I was content to sit back and watch it happen. I knew that the next few days would bring even more chaos for them, and I had no intention of helping them escape the trap they had built for themselves. They had spent years treating their employees as interchangeable parts, and now they were discovering that some parts were irreplaceable. I watched the squirrels in my yard, feeling completely detached from their corporate misery. It was a good feeling, a reminder that the real world was much larger than their office walls. I had spent 15 years of my life dedicated to their success, and they had discarded me with a text message. They deserved to feel the cold reality of the contract they had signed and ignored. By the following week, the collapse was complete. The Wall Street Journal published a short, brutal article about the litigation, highlighting the rising cost of vendor mismanagement and the legal risks of ignoring key personnel clauses in federal defense contracts. The article specifically named Hampton and Cross and noted that their failure to maintain compliance had put several logistics pipelines at risk. The firm's stock fell another 14%, and industry analysts estimated their long-term losses at over $350 million as other clients began to review their partnership terms. The reputation of the firm was ruined, and the board was in a state of complete damage control. They could no longer hide the truth from the shareholders. The board immediately called an emergency meeting and voted to fire Preston Cole. Preston was escorted from the building by security on Wednesday afternoon, holding a small cardboard box containing his gym trophies and business books. His corporate email account was deactivated before he even reached the lobby. The general counsel resigned shortly after, realizing that his name was attached to the compliance failure. The firm was forced to accept a settlement with Apex Systems, paying a massive penalty and losing the contract entirely. The board members were left to explain to the shareholders why they had allowed a junior executive to destroy their most valuable account. The entire executive suite was in a state of shock, and the company was facing the prospect of a hostile takeover. On Friday, I received a physical letter in a heavy navy envelope with the Apex Systems logo. It was a handwritten note from Galloway, inviting me to lunch at a small French bistro downtown. I showed up a few minutes early, finding him sitting at a quiet corner table with a glass of iced tea and a leather folder. He shook my hand warmly, noting that I looked much more relaxed than I had at the gala. We ordered our food, and we spent the first part of the meal talking about normal things, like my garden and his family. It was a pleasant change from the corporate stress of the last 15 years. Galloway was a man of integrity, and I respected him for the way he handled his business. He mentioned that he had watched the downfall of Hampton and Cross with a sense of inevitability, and he was glad that I was no longer caught in their net. Galloway did not waste any time with small talk once the plates were cleared. He opened the folder and slid a contract across the table. He was offering me a position as the Director of Systems Continuity at Apex Systems. The salary was twice what I had been making at Hampton and Cross, with full benefits, a flexible schedule, and a mandate to build a team of my own choosing. There were no non-compete clauses or restrictive terms. It was a straightforward offer built on mutual respect and professional competence. He told me that he valued my experience and that he wanted to ensure that Apex's logistics networks would always be secure. The offer was a validation of everything I had done, and it was a direct rebuke to Preston's ideas about legacy liabilities. I read the contract carefully, noting that the title did not contain the word legacy. I looked at Galloway and told him that I had two conditions before I signed. First, I wanted the authority to hire Brenda and Roger to manage our finance and database departments. Second, I wanted to select and train my own successor to ensure that the systems would remain stable long after I decided to retire. Galloway smiled, reached into his pocket, and handed me his pen. He said that those were not conditions, they were simply good business practices. He was glad to have us on board, and he knew that we would keep the systems running smoothly. He signed the contract on behalf of Apex Systems, and I signed it immediately after. I walked out of the bistro into the afternoon sun, feeling a light, clean breeze on my face. I had spent 15 years being the invisible ink in another man's ledger, only noticed when they wanted to erase me. Now I was the one holding the pen. I drove home, poured a glass of wine, and sat on my porch as the sun went down. The original contract page was still sitting on my desk, highlighted in yellow, a quiet reminder that in the corporate jungle, you should always check who holds the key before you decide to lock the door. The breeze was soft, and the silence was clean. I knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in 15 years, I was looking forward to them. I was no longer a legacy asset to be managed. I was the architect of my own future, and the systems I built would keep the lines moving. The future was bright, and I was ready to build something that would last. I watched the stars appear in the night sky, and I smiled at the quiet triumph of a contract honored and a job well done. It was a testament to the fact that competence and experience still matter in a world that is too often blinded by empty buzzwords and short-term savings. I took another sip of my wine, closed my eyes, and listened to the peaceful rustle of the leaves in the evening wind.